amid the golden glow of Parisian balls, where violins sang beneath gilded ceilings and the scent of costly perfume mingled with the haze of cigarette smoke. A secret bled quietly beneath layers of satin. The Morphine Brides. They were the emblems of beauty, grace, and power, yet also the victims of one of Europe's deepest addictions of the 19th century. While the world worshipped the perfection of the Belle Epoque, few realized that behind those gentle smiles and pale, luminous faces hid the sting of needles and tiny glass vials, tucked away in drawers lined with pearls. This is not merely the story of fallen aristocratic women. It is an accusation whispered against an entire civilization that blindly believed luxury was the same as happiness. In this video, you will step into that dazzling yet decaying world, where each drop of morphine slowly strangled the soul of Europe. A story so beautiful it becomes cruel, so alluring it turns terrifying, and once it begins, you won't be able to look away. And when the crystal chandeliers fade into darkness, when the laughter of the Parisian elite dissolves into the hollow air, we begin to see it clearly. That perfect beauty was only a velvet curtain hiding a tragedy untold. That is where the story truly begins, the story of the Morphine Brides, the women who traded their souls for a soft, fleeting dream in the age known as the Belle Epoque, Europe's so-called golden era. At the heart of this work lies not merely a historical or medical phenomenon, but a metaphor, a haunting reflection on the collapse of the illusions mankind built for itself. Morphine Brides is not simply the tale of noble women ensnared by addiction. It is a tragic confession of a society that painted its sorrow with rouge, wrapping loneliness and emptiness inside glittering vials and injecting them with silver needles beneath silk canopies. The Belle Epoque, a name that evokes light, art, and refinement, concealed within its elegance a dark fracture in the human soul, worn thin beneath its own luxury. When morphine was first discovered, it was hailed as the miracle of modern medicine. But that miracle soon turned into a curse for the upper class. Those women, once symbols of beauty and virtue, became prisoners of their own fragile bodies. They injected morphine not only to numb pain, but to escape, to flee from monotony, from loveless marriages, from the duty to remain flawless and radiant. In their world, morphine was more than a drug. It was a religion, a secret ritual of an aristocracy rotting beneath its own smile. The central theme of Morphine Brides hovers on the trembling border between pleasure and self-destruction, between beauty and death. Morphine becomes the emblem of a yearning, to be loved, to be understood, to be freed. And yet it is also the golden chain that binds their souls. Each injection is a whispered promise of sweetness, and also a knife carving deeper into the heart of an era. This is not merely a tale of a few fallen individuals. It is the confession of an entire civilization, a Europe so certain of its progress, its art, its intellect, and yet slowly dying within its own delusion. Behind the portraits of women draped in white lace, behind the dreamy gazes immortalized by painters, were emaciated bodies, long nights curled in anguish, and screams swallowed by silence. The narrative paints a world of dualities. On the surface, a festival of light. Beneath, an inferno of dependence. These morphine brides were not only addicted to the drug, they were addicted to the feeling of fragility itself, to being pitied, protected, adored, the very traits society had taught them to call feminine and elegant. In that, morphine became the perfect lover, gentle, discreet, unjudging. Yet, like every forbidden romance, it ended in despair and destruction. What makes this theme so piercing is how it turns the mirror toward us. Perhaps we too, in the 21st century, are repeating the same addiction, only under new names. Not morphine, but dopamine. Not needles, but screens. The need for validation, the rush of attention. Perhaps we are also living in a new Belle Epoque, where smiles are dazzling, yet souls quietly decay beneath the glow of artificial joy. Thus, Morphine Brides is not just a story of the past. It is a mirror for the present, a reminder that every form of splendor carries its price. The price of beauty can be the loss of oneself. The price of grace can be a loneliness no one sees. And the price of power is the slow erosion of freedom. The beauty in this tale, therefore, is no longer pure. It is poisoned, a beauty both enchanting and terrifying. Those women, in the eyes of society, remained symbols of poise and charm, yet in the shadows, they trembled. searching for the next injection that would keep them from collapsing. That contrast between light and darkness, between sanctity and decay, is the heartbeat of the story. For this reason, the central theme of Morphine Brides extends beyond addiction itself. It reaches into the very root of human tragedy, the desperate yearning to escape reality at any cost. When life becomes too perfect, people begin to go mad from the emptiness. When everything around them glitters, the one thing they cannot endure is themselves. Morphine was merely the excuse. The true tragedy lay in their addiction to forgetting. The story passes no judgment. It speaks in a voice of sorrow and understanding. For deep down, those Morphine Brides were simply women who wanted to love, to breathe, to exist without performance. They symbolize every soul crushed by expectation, by the demand to be flawless, by the golden cage called high society. And in their despair, they chose the only escape they could, knowing it would lead them beyond return. The theme also warns of a greater deception, the collective self-delusion of an entire age. When a society is drunk on its own beauty, no one dares speak of the dark. Doctors prescribed morphine without realizing they were slowly killing their patients. Husbands smiled at glittering banquets, hiding the wives who lay collapsed behind closed doors. The press, the artists, the fashion world, all conspired to decorate death, a society so radiant and yet so false. Thus, Morphine Brides becomes a dark symphony between luxury and despair. It chills the soul not with blood, but with silence, the stillness of a world dying behind its own perfection. Every detail, from a carved glass vial to the distant gaze of a woman framed by a window, is a note in this mournful melody. And when we look back, we realize that the most terrifying thing was never the morphine. It was the silence of those who saw, yet said nothing. The silence of the women themselves, and who, as the drug seeped into their veins and their dreams melted away, still kept the perfect smile of a lady of grace. The true journey of Morphine Brides, then, is one of stripping away illusions. It compels us to ask, how many of us live as they did? Beautiful, successful, yet hollow within. How many are addicted to something unnamed, unable to let go? And when the story ends, we finally understand. The Morphine Brides never truly belonged to the past. They are still among us, in every soul yearning for comfort, yet losing itself in the search. Because sometimes, the very thing that makes us feel alive is also the thing quietly killing us. At the heart of this work lies not merely a historical or medical phenomenon, but a profound metaphor. The collapse of the illusions humankind has built for itself. Morphine Brides is not just the chronicle of aristocratic women swept into addiction. It is a tragedy written in silk and sorrow, a lament for a society that painted over its pain, where sadness, loneliness, and emptiness were disguised within glittering vials and injected through silver needles in rooms draped with lace. The Belle Epoque, a name that evokes light, art, and refinement, concealed within its shimmering splendor a dark fracture, where the human soul grew frail beneath the weight of its own luxury. When morphine was first discovered, it was praised as the miracle of modern medicine. But that miracle swiftly turned into a curse among the upper class, where women once seen as emblems of beauty and purity became prisoners within their own fragile bodies. They injected morphine not merely to ease pain, but to escape, to flee monotony, loveless marriages, and the suffocating duty of being eternally flawless. In that world, morphine was not simply a drug. It was a religion, a secret ritual of an aristocracy decaying behind its own radiant smile. The central theme of Morphine Brides hovers delicately between pleasure and self-destruction, between beauty and death. There, morphine becomes the symbol of yearning, to be loved, to be understood, to be freed, and yet also the golden shackle that binds their souls. Each injection is a promise whispered in sweetness, and at the same time, a blade cutting deeper into the heart of the age. This story is not merely about a handful of fallen women. It is the confession of an entire civilization, a Europe that believed itself to have reached the pinnacle of progress, art, and reason, yet was dying quietly in illusion. Behind the portraits of women in white lace, behind the dreamy gazes immortalized by painters, lay emaciated bodies, sleepless nights curled in despair, and muffled screams swallowed by silence. The narrative portrays a world of duality. On the surface, a festival of light. Beneath, a hell of dependency. The Morphine Brides were not only addicted to the drug, but to the feeling of being fragile, pitied, and protected. The very traits society had taught them to call feminine and refined. To them, morphine was the perfect lover. Gentle, discreet, never judging. But, like all forbidden romances, it ended in despair and destruction. What makes this theme so haunting is how it forces us to gaze into the mirror of history. Perhaps we, living in the 21st century, are reliving the same addiction, only under new disguises. Not morphine, but dopamine. Not vials, but screens. The thrill of attention. The intoxication of approval. Perhaps we too are living in a new Belle Epoque, where humanity smiles brilliantly while the soul quietly withers beneath waves of artificial ecstasy. Thus, Morphine Brides is not only a story of the past, it is a mirror of the present. It reminds us that every form of splendor carries its price. The price of beauty may be the loss of the self. The price of grace may be a loneliness unseen. And the price of power, the surrender of freedom to live authentically. The beauty within this tale is no longer pure. It is tainted, corrupted, a beauty both alluring and terrifying. Those women, in the eyes of society, remained icons of charm and elegance. Yet in the shadows, they trembled, reaching for the next injection just to keep from collapsing. That contrast between light and darkness, sanctity and decay, is the heartbeat of the story. For this reason, the core theme of Morphine Brides extends far beyond the portrayal of addiction. It strikes at the root of human tragedy, the desperate longing to escape reality at any cost. When life becomes too perfect, people begin to lose their minds to emptiness. When everything around them gleams, the one thing they cannot endure is themselves. Morphine was merely the excuse. The true tragedy lay in their addiction to forgetting. The story does not judge, it speaks with compassion and sorrow. Deep down, the Morphine Brides were simply women who longed to love, to breathe, to exist without performance. They stand as symbols for every soul suffocated by expectation, by the pressure to be perfect, by the golden cage called high society. And in their despair, they chose the only escape they could find, even knowing it was a path of no return. The central theme of Morphine Brides is also a warning, a revelation of collective self-deception. When an entire society dreams in flowers, no one dares to speak of the dark. Doctors prescribed morphine without realizing they were slowly killing their patients. Husbands smiled at glittering banquets, hiding wives who lay collapsed behind closed doors. The press, the artists, the world of fashion, all were complicit in a dawning death, a society so radiant and yet so false. Thus, Morphine Brides becomes a dark symphony, composed between luxury and despair. It chills not through violence, but through silence, the stillness of a world dying beneath its own perfection. Every detail, from the carved glass vial to the distant gaze of a woman by the window, is a note in that mournful sonata. And when we look back, we realize that the most terrifying thing was never the morphine itself, but the silence of those who saw, yet said nothing. The silence of the women themselves, as each dose seeped into their veins, as their dreams dissolved. They still wore the unbroken smile of a perfect lady. The true essence of Morphine Brides is a journey of stripping away illusions. It compels us to ask, how many of us live as they did? Beautiful, successful, yet hollow inside. How many are addicted to something nameless, afraid even to call it by its true name? And when the story finally closes, we understand. The Morphine Brides never truly belong to the past. They live among us still, in every soul that longs for comfort, yet loses itself in the search for it. Because sometimes, the very thing that makes us feel alive is also the thing that quietly kills us each day. Every plague begins with innocence. Morphine, the child of science, the pride of 19th century medicine, first appeared beneath the halo of a man-made miracle. It was distilled from the resin of the opium poppy, pure and glimmering in its little glass vials, hailed by doctors as the graceful gift of modern medicine. At first, morphine was used to ease pain, the pain of soldiers returning from battlefields, the pain of women in childbirth, the pain of the restless mind. But soon people discovered that it soothed not only the body, it soothed the soul. And from that moment, an invisible addiction began to bloom within the heart of elegant Europe. By the 1870s, morphine had become a symbol of intellect and progress. Physicians in white coats holding silver syringes were revered as dispensers of miracles. In glittering salons, people spoke of morphine as if it were a new vintage of wine. "It makes sleep deeper," they whispered. "It lets the mind drift into dreams." Gradually, morphine was no longer a medicine. It became a refined ritual of the upper class. By the 1880s, Europe had entered a silent epidemic. Medical reports of the time recorded that up to 60% of aristocratic women in major cities, Paris, Vienna, Berlin, London, were dependent on morphine. Yet no one dared call it addiction. Society had no such word. To them, morphine was merely a private remedy, a treatment for the weary spirit. Doctors continued prescribing it, pharmacists continued selling it, and the world kept drifting deeper into its own golden sleep. The true cause of this epidemic lay not only in chemistry, but in the psychology of an entire class. European aristocrats had been raised to be delicate, to be refined, to live like flowers in glass cages. They were forbidden to ache, to break, to appear coarse. Yet within them grew loneliness, emptiness, and a desperate longing for freedom. Morphine appeared as a key, unlocking a weightless realm where they could float, dream, and for a moment, cease to be themselves. The spread of morphine was not an explosion, but a quiet seepage, like water slipping through stone walls. In rooms veiled with white lace curtains, ladies began to hide their vials inside powder boxes, jewelry drawers, even hairpins. Silver syringes with needles fine as strands of hair rested in pearl-inlaid cases, at once medical tools and ornaments. Morphine was commercialized and sanctified, transformed into a symbol of luxury and power. And so, society began to build an aesthetic addiction. People no longer hid morphine out of shame. They displayed it as proof of sensitivity and intellect. A woman who could measure the perfect dose, who knew how to blend morphine with perfume, was considered a woman of taste. Thus, addiction was legitimized by beauty, draped in lace, silk, and candlelight. What made this epidemic truly dangerous was not its scale, but its silence. Everyone knew, no one spoke. Doctors kept prescribing to patients they knew would never recover. Families kept smiling at dinners, knowing that the wife, the mother, the daughter was quietly fading away. The Belle Epoque feared scandal more than death. So, they chose silence, choosing to live within the illusion of perfection. The morphine plague spread in a way no war could rival. It did not kill instantly, but through forgetting. A generation of women disappeared slowly. They slept more, ate less, spoke softly. They became almost translucent, as if morphine had drained the color of life from their veins. And the world called them beautiful. Morphine beauty, pale skin, ashen lips, distant eyes, became the aesthetic ideal in paintings, in photographs, in fashion. Art, instead of condemning the tragedy, glorified it. Morphine's reach also created a hidden ecosystem where manufacturers, pharmacists, and physicians became a new elite. They controlled its flow as bankers controlled gold, as churches controlled faith. Pharmaceutical empires flourished while the nobility decayed. Unaware they were being manipulated, a new economy was born, an economy of dependence, at the heart of glittering Europe. From Paris, the morphine wave swept to Vienna, where Freud began experimenting with narcotics. Then to London, where ladies hid their vials inside tiny handbags. And to Berlin, where morphine could be purchased freely at any pharmacy. In Switzerland, powerful drug companies produced pure painkillers, exporting them across the continent. And while thousands of women drifted into dreams, the world still called that era beautiful. Yet perhaps the greatest tragedy was not the number of deaths, but how addiction was passed down as a social ritual. Mothers taught daughters, grandmothers taught granddaughters, not through genes, but through tiny bottles hidden in drawers, through weary yet graceful glances, through gentle advice. When you feel sad, take just a little. Generation after generation, morphine became the silent inheritance of noble women, a refined sickness no one dared to end. In the final decade of the Belle Epoque, decay reached the roots. Addiction was no longer personal, it was collective. Society as a whole was intoxicated, from drawing rooms to bedrooms, from physicians to painters. Even the intellectuals, those meant to stay clear-headed, succumbed to morphine's dreamy allure. Every poem, every melody, every painting of that age carried the same flavor, sweet, languid, and deathly. When the epidemic reached its peak, no one called it a disease anymore. It had become part of culture. Each morning, hundreds of thousands of needles pierced the smooth skin of Europe's noblewomen. There were no screams, no pain, only a soft sigh of relief and eyes sinking into illusion. And so, day by day, week by week, year by year, Europe quietly poisoned itself with elegance. Morphine did not only kill bodies, it murdered the soul of an era. It made people forget what it meant to feel, to love, to hurt, the very things that made them alive. And when humanity no longer felt pain, it no longer felt anything at all. The Belle Époque, with all its light, art, and wine, became the last banquet before mankind stepped into war. Looking back, the morphine epidemic was not merely a medical chapter, but the evidence of an age so enchanted with itself that it chose self-destruction, an era that believed it was immortal, yet collapsed because of a drop of clear liquid no larger than a fingertip. And in that collapse, the Morphine Brides, fragile, radiant, and alone, became immortal images of decaying splendor. For sometimes, what destroys a civilization is not war or poverty, but the very gentleness it worships too much. The spread of morphine left behind not only withered bodies, but also the disintegration of the very foundations of Belle Epoque society, a period once celebrated as the pinnacle of human civilization, when the aristocrats, artists, and intellectuals, the spiritual leaders of Europe, fell under morphine's spell. The entire social order began to tilt. The upper class, once the model of elegance and refinement, became a distorted reflection of emptiness and decay. Morphine changed not only bodies, but the way people perceived the world. In that gentle intoxication, they lost all sense of reality. Political conflicts, social unrest, the cries of the working class, all were forgotten amid the white haze of indulgence. The nobility dreamed in artificial bliss, while the lower classes simmered in resentment. The gulf between wealth and poverty, already deep, grew unbridgeable, and in silence, those seeds of discontent became the tremors that would one day erupt into the First World War. Among women, the consequences were even more tragic. Those confined by the ideal of being delicate, tender, easily wounded, were ultimately consumed by that very image. Morphine came to them first as a secret friend, a comfort against pressure, loneliness, and loveless marriages, an escape from the suffocating emptiness of endless soirees. But soon it turned them into smiling ghosts, beings suspended between life and death. They still appeared in paintings, in photographs, in poetry, but no longer as real women. They had become symbols of fragility, of fading beauty, a beauty that society adored and emulated. In the cruelest of ways, addiction redefined the notion of elegant femininity. Fashion magazines praised pallid skin, dry lips, distant eyes, all symptoms of morphine. The art of the Belle Époque, instead of resisting, glorified this slow decay. Painters depicted slender ladies reclining on velvet couches bathed in silver light. Poets described them as flowers dreaming within delirium. Novelists likened them to fallen angels, so beautiful that one might wish to die beside them. Thus, Belle Époque culture became a love song to decline. Every painting, every melody, every verse carried a shadow of death, but death made exquisite, refined, and seductive. People no longer feared dying. They feared being ugly, crude, or real. At lavish parties, guests even discussed morphine as if debating philosophy. To die in morphine is to die with a smile. That whispered phrase became the secret manifesto of a generation bent on self-destruction. Socially, morphine's aftermath seeped into every corner of life. Families crumbled in silence. Husbands hid their wives' vials. Wives concealed syringes in jewelry boxes. Children grew up between cold embraces and mornings when their mothers would not wake. Doctors, those meant to heal, became the patrons of addiction, prescribing to preserve their ties with the elite. An entire network of medicine, commerce, and morality, from hospitals to pharmacies, became a machinery sustaining collective illusion. It was not only society that weakened, morality itself eroded. As morphine became a symbol of luxury, people began to confuse beauty with danger. They learned to admire those who destroyed themselves, to treat fragility as fashionable, to see suffering as romantic. That was the moment European culture lost its compass. The values of strength, self-discipline, and compassion, the very pillars of the Western spirit, were replaced by a melancholic hedonism, a world revolving entirely around emotion and exquisite excess. Beauty, once the emblem of life, became an excuse for self-destruction. In opera halls and galleries, people wept over the deaths of tragic muses, never realizing they were walking toward the same fate. Artists who once mirrored the conscience of their age no longer wrote to awaken, they wrote to glorify despair. Death became an aesthetic, and morphine, the key that opened the door to the final beauty. From a historical view, the Belle Epoque was not only an age of light and creation, but also an age of escape. Morphine was not its sole cause, but it was the perfect symbol of a mindset that refused to awaken. When life grew too complicated, with political turmoil, industrial disruption, and the looming shadow of war, people chose to remain intoxicated, drunk on morphine, drunk on art, drunk on the illusion that the world was still perfect. And in that haze, Europe slid quietly into the darkest chapter of the 20th century. Culturally, morphine birthed a pathological aesthetic, one that linked beauty to weakness, luxury to depression. The image of the Morphine Bride, pale, trembling, eyes lost in distance, became a recurring motif for decades. It seeped into cinema, fashion, and photography, immortalized as the emblem of noble sorrow. The chilling truth was that society did not merely pity them, it aspired to become them. It was the sanctification of suffering, a new religion for the modern age. Look deeper, and the morphine addiction reveals itself as the mirror of an age-wide spiritual sickness. A world exhausted by its own perfection, by the pressure to be beautiful, to be happy, to never falter. People no longer knew how to face themselves, so they sought the one substance that made them stop feeling altogether. It was not just personal collapse, it was a collective identity crisis. The Belle Epoque did not fall because of war, it decayed from within. From the moment humanity lost its ability to endure real pain. And like all addictions, morphine left behind a vast emptiness. When the dream faded, Europe awoke amid the ashes of its former pride. The morphine ladies were gone, but their shadows lingered, haunting art, memory, and the modern psyche. They became elegant ghosts, forever reminding humanity that beauty without awareness is merely a drug that numbs the soul. The morphine epidemic taught mankind a bitter truth, that civilization is not the same as freedom, and progress is not the same as happiness. It showed how a society can be so magnificent that it blinds itself, so refined that it destroys itself. The Belle Epoque seemed like paradise, yet beneath its golden light lay a white inferno. And when the final velvet curtain fell, only one question echoed softly amid the ashes of its vanished balls. Can humanity ever be truly civilized, if it must rely on illusion to survive in the world it has built? In the world of the Belle Epoque, power was once defined by bloodlines, lineage, and titles. But morphine, that milky white potion, melted the boundaries between master and servant, between the noble and the common. When the grand ladies lay motionless upon their beds in dreamlike stupor, it was the servants, once invisible at every banquet, who now held the vital secrets of the household. They knew the hours of injection, the doses, the moods. They hid the bottles in drawers, diluted the liquid to stretch the supply, wiped away the shameful traces. Inside those vast mansions, the masters no longer ruled. They had become puppets in the hands of those who once served them. Ironically, those once considered lowly now orchestrated the rhythm of aristocratic life. They knew how to disguise addiction, whom to protect, whom to silence, whom to remove. Some servants even used their knowledge of morphine as leverage, bargaining for status, or becoming their mistresses' private therapists. In the grand estates of Paris, Vienna, and St. Petersburg, power no longer rested on titles, but in the hands that held the syringe. Doctors and pharmacists, who once stood in the background, now stepped onto the stage of power. They understood addiction's mechanisms, the workings of the human psyche, and most importantly, they controlled the supply. Each vial sold was not merely a product, but a key to survival for entire bloodlines. The physician became a secret lover, a co-conspirator, even a savior to be revered. The honor of an aristocrat no longer lay in medals or estates, but in the ledger of debts owed to the pharmacy. At the same time, morphine manufacturers and pharmaceutical merchants rose as a new aristocracy. They had no blue blood, yet wielded real power. the kind that could bring down a noble family simply by halting the flow of drugs. They sponsored soirees, concerts, art galleries. They mingled with high society and were received with reverence. Thus, the social order inverted. Those who once served the health of the nobility now controlled their very existence. This upheaval spread far beyond the salons, seeping into the economy and culture itself. Banks and insurance companies began crafting special policies for morphine addicts, quietly profiting from their despair. Confidential loans and long-term healthcare contracts were created to sustain the lifestyles of the addicted ladies. But in truth, they bound them in invisible chains of debt. A new world was born, a world that thrived on weakness. Not only medicine and finance, but even fashion, music, architecture, and religion adapted to the new reality. Fashion designed sleeves to hide fragile arms, high collars to conceal needle marks. Music turned wistful and hazy, echoing the weary spirit of an addicted age. Churches, while denouncing sin, held spiritual retreats for the aristocracy, where morphine was quietly used to soothe the soul. Everything was veiled in gentle words: tranquilizer, relaxation, inner journey. Hypocrisy, elegant and perfumed, became the heartbeat of the era. Most tragically, morphine did not merely destroy power structures, it shattered human bonds. In a society where everyone relied on everyone else to conceal the truth, trust became a luxury. Servants watched their masters not to serve them, but to control them. Husbands hid from wives, wives from children, children bribed servants to uncover their mother's secrets. A dark web was spun, where loyalty was replaced by fear and affection by pity. In that atmosphere, it was the lower classes who began to rise. Servants, doctors, artists, even drug dealers became the true shapers of the age. They needed no titles. They had knowledge and access to those once untouchable. A kind of underground democracy emerged, not through revolution or rebellion, but through the quiet decay of the old order. And then, as economic and cultural power slipped into the hands of the once despised, something frightening happened. Evil itself became refined. It was no longer crude greed or open cruelty, but manipulation cloaked in grace. Morphine was poured into crystal bottles, the trade in drugs disguised as acts of healing. Every sin bore the face of kindness. Europe, in its intoxication, had invented a new form of power, the power of dependency. If once the nobility maintained order through land and blood, now that order was upheld through secrets and fear. The more one knew, the more powerful one became. And in that world, it was the servants who knew the most. They witnessed the convulsions, the tears, the whispered confessions in the dark. They held the keys to a kingdom of deceit. From the shadows, they became the true rulers, the stewards of decay. The tragedy lay in the fact that this reversal came not from revolution, but from rot. No one rose up to overthrow, yet everything collapsed. No one was executed, yet an entire society was poisoned. The new classes that emerged bore no ideals, only the hunger for power. And so, the spiral of corruption continued, merely trading roles between master and slave. In art and culture, this inversion left its unmistakable mark. The aristocracy, once the muse of creation, became the object of ridicule. They appeared in caricatures, novels, and plays as pitiful, grotesque figures, both to be scorned and pitied. In contrast, the servant, the doctor, the starving artist were elevated as symbols of truth, the few who remained lucid in the midst of delirium. It was one of those rare moments in history when art ceased to glorify the elite and instead gaze straight into their decay. If the Belle Epoque once prided itself as the age of light, then under the spell of morphine, that light fractured into countless pale beams, illuminating every shadow people once feared to see. Beauty, power, and luxury all fused into a dangerous alloy, the beauty of decay. And thus, the old social order, thought to be eternal, began to crumble from within without gunfire or revolution. All it took were doses strong enough, needles fine enough, and an aristocracy weak enough. When they were high, the world shifted. When they sank, others rose. And when the dawn of the 20th century arrived, Europe looked at its reflection and could no longer tell who was the master and who was the servant. This inversion was not merely the result of addiction, but the inevitable outcome of a civilization built on illusion. When people believed that wealth, beauty, and power could shield them from pain, they had already surrendered their souls to that white, milky god. And when the addiction reached the roots of society, it was not just the aristocrats who fell, but the very order that once held them upright dissolved into mist. And in that moment, when master and servant traded places, when the noble and the lowly merged, the Belle Epoque of Europe crossed the point of no return. And from within that great inversion of class, a new order quietly began to rise. Subtle, intricate, and far more dangerous than anything before. When honor became a curtain and status only a shell, European aristocracy entered an era in which secrets no longer lived in diaries or whispers behind ballroom doors, but were traded, managed, and protected with money, morphine, and blood. From the glittering palaces bathed in candlelight to the dim basements beneath their mansions, Belle Epoque Europe had unwittingly built a hidden empire, a realm where morphine was currency, power, and the new religion of souls that had lost themselves. When people could no longer speak openly of their addiction, everything found its own way to survive. Thus emerged a network of dependence, delicate yet vast, weaving itself through every corner of aristocratic life and stretching invisible hands across the continent. Secret laboratories sprouted within garden pavilions, where private physicians prepared custom doses of morphine for each lady, adjusted to her moods, her pain, and the time of day. The injection rooms were arranged like spas, adorned with velvet drapes, crystal lamps, and the faint scent of lavender, places where pain was exchanged for the soft illusion of peace. Beyond that, there were the disguised aristocratic retreats, advertised as spiritual sanctuaries, that became gathering places for women bound by the same secret. They sat together in silence and reverie, sharing their doses and the nameless emptiness within. Here, morphine was no longer a drug, but a ritual. Each injection became a confession, a small doorway opening into a world where social rules dissolved into mist. What made this network truly terrifying, however, was not its reach, but its precision. A whole underground economy emerged to sustain the addiction, from pharmaceutical factories in Switzerland to merchants shipping through the Mediterranean, to banks in Paris, Vienna, and London. All were part of a supply chain draped in legitimacy. Morphine passed through customs under the label medical product, shipped by mail, even carried aboard the European express trains like luxury goods. And in this way, morphine slowly became a symbol of power. Those who could afford the finest morphine displayed their status. Those who could conceal their addiction proved their influence. Many aristocratic ladies turned the act of injection into an art of living, purchasing golden cases, pearl-engraved syringes, and crystal vials etched with their monograms. Each dose was a jewel, each needle mark a discrete emblem of class. As money and morphine entwined, this economy of addiction fed not only the upper class, but countless lives orbiting it. Servants became secret intermediaries, learning how to preserve the drug, measure the proper dose, erase the traces. Pharmacists became shadowy figures of power, holding the secrets of entire bloodlines. Drug merchants, mostly middle-class men, suddenly held the leverage to manipulate the very nobles who had once looked down on them. It was a world turned upside down, where the wealthy became the enslaved, and the common man held their breath in his hand. Even fashion, architecture, and music were swept into this current. Houses were designed with hidden compartments for morphine, with mirrored panels, vanities concealing drawers, armchairs with hollowed arms. Jewelry became a vessel for concealment, necklaces hiding tiny morphine flasks, rings containing retractable needles. Jewelry houses in Paris, Vienna, and Milan competed to craft discreet accessories for their elegantly addicted clientele. And when everything could be monetized, an underground banking system arose to sustain the illusion. Many noblewomen mortgaged their estates just to maintain their morphine lifestyle. Merchants, doctors, even priests all shared in the profits. Each vial carried not only medical value, but social currency, proof of privilege, a badge of belonging. But the most chilling part was the silence. All of Europe knew, and yet no one spoke. Newspapers hinted in allegories, paintings concealed hidden meanings, music echoed with tones of exhaustion and decline. It was a collective conspiracy, a continent-wide agreement to remain blind. Morphine became the public secret of the age, like a two-sided mirror, reflecting beauty on one face and decay on the other. Once this network had taken root, escape became impossible. A noblewoman in Berlin once wrote in her diary, "Morphine is no longer inside me, I am inside it." That single line, so intimate and fragile, was the sigh of an entire civilization shackled by the sweetness of its own destruction. The underground web was more than a drug supply. It was a reflection of a parallel world, where addiction became ritual, sin became art, and ruin wore the mask of elegance. Looking back, we can see that this network of addiction was a mirror of the Belle Epoque itself, exquisite, refined, and rotting from within. It revealed how people, terrified of truth, chose to live in illusions. When the glowing mansions became mere masks for trembling bodies and trembling hearts, it was clear 19th century Europe was not merely addicted to morphine, it was addicted to its own deception. For at its core, morphine was never just a chemical. It was a symbol of dependence, on power, on beauty, on the glittering lies humans built to avoid themselves. And within that hidden network, one could see more than syringes and glass vials. One could see the quiet failure of an age that no longer knew the line between light and darkness, between luxury and despair, between life and a death that felt too beautiful to resist. From the moment that secret networks seeped into every corner of aristocratic life, the world of the Belle Epoque ceased to be merely a society addicted in silence. It became a distorted civilization, where both culture and politics were shaped by trembling hands and glassy, intoxicated eyes. Once morphine became the lifeblood of the age, it did not only destroy individual bodies, it shook the very foundations of Europe's most intricate structures of power. The palaces of Paris, Vienna, and St. Petersburg still shimmered with light, but within those golden halls dwelled clouded minds, dazed spirits, and a continent slowly losing the ability to control itself. The first and deepest blow fell upon culture. The entire European aesthetic became veiled in a hazy mist, the mist of morphine. Painting, literature, and music all surrendered to an enchantment with melancholy, fragility, and decay. Artists painted women with pallid skin, weary eyes, and parted lips caught in a dream, no longer symbols of life, but of exquisite ruin. Cold tones, broken light, and blurred outlines conquered the galleries. Beauty ceased to mean vitality. It became a slow dying, an aesthetic of collapse. In literature, addiction was romanticized, baptized as sacred dreams. Writers, as if hypnotized by languor itself, began to glorify despair, finding luxury in surrender and death as a graceful escape. There, one can trace the shadow of morphine. It transformed suffering into an ornament, depression into fashion. Society began to worship the beauty of ruin, as though even death could be draped in silk and gold. Music, too, drifted into that narcotic trance. The melodies of the late 19th century carried a strange melancholy, suspended between reality and illusion, wakefulness and dream. Triumph vanished. Hope in the future faded. The composition slowed, sighed, and lingered like the final breath of a civilization dissolving in pleasure's fog. Concert halls turned into sanctuaries of escape, where listeners sought solace in the shared ache of dulled souls. The culture of the Belle Epoque became the echo of a society addicted, enchanting, sorrowful, and dreamlike. Yet the influence did not end with art. It reached into politics, where the fate of nations was decided by men and women hiding their secret dependence. As aristocratic women, the linchpins of marriage alliances and diplomacy, sank deeper into addiction, the balance of power began to tremble. A wife enslaved to morphine could no longer manage social relations, mediate between dynasties, or embody her family's honor. Marriages crumbled in silence, dragging with them political alliances that had taken decades to build. In courts such as those of Austria-Hungary, Russia, and France, noblewomen once acted as confidants and quiet advisors to kings and parliaments. But as morphine crept into the corridors of power, counsel grew hazy and decisions indecisive. It was whispered that many influential ladies attended state gatherings half awake, smiling distantly, their eyes adrift. That spiritual exhaustion seeped from palaces to parliaments, shrouding governance in a fog, not of weather, but of syringes. Morphine did not merely weaken the nobility, it eroded the very notion of civic duty. When leaders drowned in artificial bliss, they forgot that power is a responsibility, not a privilege. The age witnessed the birth of power vacuums, disastrous decisions, and colonial or financial crises, all rooted in spiritual decay. A Europe that once ruled the world found itself paralyzed by its own indulgence. Even international relations were not spared. Marital treaties, once the strongest instruments of diplomacy, lost their weight when noble women could no longer perform their roles. Many political relationships fractured when scandals involving morphine leaked into the public eye. And thus, while empires outwardly preached peace, progress, and cooperation, within their velvet curtains, they were already disintegrating, undone by the trembling hands of women behind the drapes. As the aristocracy weakened, power shifted to more pragmatic hands. The industrialists, the pharmacists, and the bankers. These were the people who understood the economic value of addiction and exploited it to manipulate markets, politics, and even the press. Newspapers were paid to praise the miraculous effects of morphine. Doctors received money to continue prescribing it. Politicians looked away for the sake of profit. Politics turned into a game of those who could exploit human frailty. A world where power rested not on intellect or virtue, but on the ability to supply illusion. Thus a vicious cycle was born. Morphine weakened the nobility. The nobility lost political control. The bourgeoisie and pharmaceutical powers took over. They fueled morphine consumption to sustain profits, and society spiraled further into addiction. It was a self-destructive machine, one too intricate, too profitable for anyone to admit existed. Beneath the soft amber glow of Paris and Berlin, Europe seemed radiant, prosperous, civilized, enlightened. But if one listened closely, another sound emerged. The soft clink of spoons against glass vials, the whisper of a needle-piercing skin, the sigh of half-conscious breath. That was the true heartbeat of the era, not the rhythm of life, but of fading. Culturally, morphine planted in Europe a long-lasting obsession, the fear of idleness and illusion. Politically, it undermined traditional hierarchies, paving the way for new forces, colder, sharper, more ruthless. And perhaps within this very addiction lay the prophecy of the 20th century's tragedies. When humanity becomes too enamored with pleasure, it loses its judgment. When power severs itself from responsibility, the world inevitably marches toward war. Morphine, then, is not merely the ghost of the Belle Epoque. It is a timeless warning. The more beautiful and perfect a civilization becomes, the more easily it can lose its soul. And Europe of the 19th century, intoxicated by its own light and art, never realized that those tiny glass vials were quietly draining the lifeblood of an entire age. When power, art, and morality fall asleep together, all that remains is mist, the fading shimmer of a Belle Epoque both magnificent and dying in silence. And then, beyond all the velvet curtains of power and the fog of morphine, when the music fades and the candles flicker out, only one question lingers in the air. What did it all amount to? The wealth, the elegance, the progress. The answer, if it exists, lies in the silence of the Belle Epoque. It is not merely the story of an era long gone, but a mirror reflecting an eternal obsession, that humankind may build palaces of gold, yet burn its own soul within their light. Morphine Brides is not simply a fragment of history. It is a metaphor for self-destruction wrapped in perfection. Morphine, in its deepest sense, is not only the white drug that numbs the body, but also the symbol of a spiritual addiction shared by an entire civilization. Europe, once so proud of its reason, science, art, and refinement, had unwittingly turned those very virtues into narcotics. They were addicted to their own sophistication, to the beauty of death, to the illusion that they were living at humanity's peak, while in truth, they were sinking, gracefully and with pleasure, into oblivion. The story's greatest message lies in the dark side of perfection. For when a society believes it has reached the summit of civilization, when humans believe they can control everything, from emotion to body to destiny, that is precisely when they begin to lose their instinct to survive. Morphine does not kill immediately. It is gentle, tender, sweet, like a lullaby. And that is the tragedy. It makes people feel loved, serene, at peace, even as it quietly drains their life away. The noble women in this tale were not merely addicted to the drug. They were addicted to the illusion of safety, to the feeling of being fragile, sheltered beneath the delicate mask of graceful femininity that society had molded for them. They were taught that suffering was unbecoming, that strength was coarse, that a refined lady must be delicate, faint, forever in need of rescue, and so morphine became their perfect lover. A silent comfort, a miracle that replaced tears. Yet within that gentleness they lost their souls, becoming slaves to the very image society had created for them. On a broader scale, Morphine Brides stands as a warning to every civilization. No progress is immune to decay. The Belle Epoque was once hailed as Europe's golden age. The streets were lit by electricity, trains crossed borders, art flourished, science opened new frontiers. Yet that pride bred blindness. People believed every problem could be solved by formula, by technique, by reason. And when morphine appeared as a medical miracle, no one doubted it, because they trusted too deeply in the radiant light of their own progress. And that is the most terrifying truth. The tragedy of the Belle Epoque did not come from darkness, but from light. It was not born of ignorance, but of too much knowledge, knowledge so abundant that humility was lost. Morphine became the embodiment of humankind's blind faith in absolute control. The very belief that made them forget that within every act of progress lies the seed of decline. That message still holds, true more than a century later, for every era has its own kind of morphine, be it technology, fame, wealth, or social media. Things that make us believe we are in control, while in truth, they are the ones controlling us. Like the Parisian ladies of the 19th century, we too are living within an illusion. The busier we are, the more connected and dazzling our lives appear, the closer we drift toward the emptiness within. And that is why Morphine Brides is haunting. Not because it is distant, but because it is familiar. We are those people, living amid the glow of achievement, yet burdened by invisible fatigue. Souls chasing artificial happiness, unaware that our emotions are slowly becoming numb. We no longer inject morphine into our veins. We inject it into our minds. Through perfectly filtered images, through praise, through the illusion of recognition we crave each day. The humanity of the story lies in this truth. Every addiction begins with loneliness. The loneliness of women trapped in silk gowns and reputations. The loneliness of souls yearning for genuine affection, but finding comfort only in the needle's whisper. And the loneliness of an entire civilization, too vast for anyone to save, too proud to admit its own frailty. Morphine, in the end, is only the curtain. The real wound lies deep within the human heart. The haunting beauty of Morphine Brides comes from the silence of its tragedy. There is no screaming, no blood, only faces fading into pallor, laughter growing faint, and white hands trembling at the break of dawn. Death here is not violent. It is serene, elegant, and proper. Yet in that softness lies the sharpest accusation. When death becomes part of aesthetics, the morality of a society has already collapsed. This story compels us to look inward, not just as individuals, but as participants in a civilization. It asks, are we truly living or merely anesthetized? Are we using our own kind of morphine to mask inner pain, pretending that everything is fine? And if so, will we dare to wake, to face the real ache? Or will we keep floating in the sweet dream history once called the Belle Epoque? Morphine Brides mirrors the harshest truth of all, that the most beautiful things can sometimes be what kills us. That humanity never truly falls because of darkness, but because it cannot resist the dazzling brightness of its own illusions. And that sometimes to live is to dare to hurt, to be imperfect, to be vulnerable, rather than pretend to be flawless. For in the end, when the ballroom music dies, when the candlelight in the morphine chambers fades away, only one story remains echoing through the night. The price of perfection is the human soul. And if the Belle Epoque was its symbol, then Morphine Brides is the eternal reminder that sometimes true awareness is not found in the light, but in the courage to face the darkness within ourselves. And as if to cradle that profound message, the entire artistic structure of Morphine Brides is woven by a hand both delicate and merciless, a composition that resembles the very morphine it portrays. Smooth, flowing, sweet, yet secretly draining the soul of its life with every breath. If in the previous part we saw its humanistic depth and its warning about civilization's self-destruction, then here we witness how the work turns its own artistic form into a weapon of storytelling, one that enchants and terrifies at once, drawing the viewer into opulence while quietly revealing the abyss beneath the silk. The structure of Morphine Brides is not a straight line, but a spiral, like the morphine addiction itself, like humanity's self-erasure in pleasure. Each scene, each image, each fragment of the story circles back, repeating, but never quite the same. We see refrains of the same parties, the same glimmering vials, the same pale smiles, repeated so often they become hypnotic. This rhythm of recurrence seduces the viewer into a state of subconscious intoxication, as if they too are being injected with the white drug, not into their veins, but into their minds. This spiral structure gives form to meaning. It allows the audience not only to understand numbness and disorientation, but to feel it. What is special is that the story refuses the conventional arc. No clear beginning, climax, or end, but moves instead like a morphine melody, starting softly, swelling into ecstasy, then dissolving into silence. This non-linearity deprives the viewer of any sense of time. They drift among images, memories, and broken fragments, exactly like the mind of an addict suspended between dream and reality. Such ambiguity turns the narrative into a powerful metaphor, transforming it from a private tragedy into an allegory for the collective amnesia of an age. In terms of rhythm, Morphine Brides breathes. It slows, quickens, falters, then gasps. That is no accident. Its tempo mirrors the body's biological rhythm under morphine, floating dreamily one moment, plunging into hollow stillness the next. Long takes, soft lighting, and gentle transitions create the sensation of walking a fragile thread between life and oblivion. Each detail, each camera movement, each pause feels like a heartbeat slowing, then stopping. Deeper still, the structure is built upon parallel contrasts, light and darkness, luxury and decay, life and death. Every dazzling ballroom scene is followed by emptiness, cold rooms, the fall of a pin, tired eyes meeting themselves in mirrors. This contrast is not merely visual, but emotional, a rhythm of rise and fall, delirium and clarity, love and fear. These interwoven opposites form a symbolic gravity. The viewer is drawn to beauty, but forced to witness the quiet collapse beneath it. The structure is reinforced by repeating symbolic imagery, a private visual language made of objects. The syringe, the mirror, the white gown, the glass vial, the candle, the crystal glass. Each time they reappear, they carry a deeper meaning. The mirror, once a simple reflection of beauty, becomes a sign of fractured identity. The morphine vial, once an elixir, becomes an urn for the spirit. Through these visual repetitions, the story gradually transforms from realism into surrealism, making the viewer feel lost within a dream of exquisite decay. One of the most refined elements lies in the shifting voice of narration, a dance between present and memory. The story is not told only through words, but through light, framing, and rhythm. At times, the voice retreats, letting the characters drift through space, as though the audience themselves are walking in that dream. And when the voice returns, it does not speak merely as a narrator, but as conscience itself, quiet, tender, cutting deep. The blending of narration and poetry, of reality and hallucination, lifts the structure of Morphine Brides beyond storytelling into a full-body emotional experience. We cannot overlook the art of spatial contrast, the backbone of the film's visual composition. Scenes are paired to collide, the glowing ballroom beside the icy bedroom, golden light against pale blue, orchestral harmony against fragmented breaths. These oppositions do more than enliven the frame. They mirror the soul's fragmentation, torn between the urge to live and the wish to forget, the desire for love and the fear of exposure. The structure makes us feel as if we are listening to a symphony composed of light and shadow, where each note of brilliance harmonizes with a note of decline. From a cinematic perspective, Morphine Brides is a triumph of sensory structure, one that relies not on dialogue or plot, but on the audience's perception. It makes you feel rather than simply understand. Each repeated detail, each deliberate cut carries its own breath. The viewer, even without realizing, is guided not by logic but by pulse and emotion. This is storytelling through heartbeat, not through words. The success of its structure lies in its perfect harmony between form and meaning. The story speaks of delirium, and the structure itself induces delirium. The story drifts into nothingness, and the spiral structure carries the viewer there too. This is not technique. It is philosophy. Form becomes meaning, structure becomes soul. Just as morphine numbs both flesh and time, the structure of Morphine Brides dissolves the viewer's sense of linearity and direction. And within that disorientation, truth emerges. And perhaps it is precisely this slow, dreamlike, haunting design that gives Morphine Brides its timelessness. It does not tell us a story. It lets us live through one. It does not teach. It makes us feel the trembling of the soul as it drifts into reverie. And when the screen finally darkens, its echo lingers, a resonance not measured by reason, but only felt by the heart. For that reason, Morphine Brides is not merely a work about women consumed by morphine. It is an artistic structure that turns the audience themselves into addicts. Addicts of beauty, of tragedy, of sorrow wrapped in silk. That is its greatest brilliance, and also the bitter smile of art itself. When death is rendered in perfect beauty, we cannot turn away. We can only remain silent, trembling, realizing that sometimes it is precisely that perfection which traps us forever.